Today, I'll be talking to you about what I call the new Frontend Toolkit. We'll look at a few new concepts that have been available for either a few years or months, or something that's completely bleeding edge. And this is actually a very nice continuation of Dylan's talk just before lunch, where he touched upon a few of the things I might be mentioning today. And yeah, a good segue into what I'll show you. But the main focus, of course, will be the new Popover API and the new Dialog element, which lets you create these kind of cool, not just cool, but actual widespread UI elements in a very native and what I would call like a seamless way, without needing any external dependencies or third-party libraries, which people mostly use today. This will be a live coding kind of presentation, so I won't have too many slides, but I have a small agenda for us just so we know what we're going to look at. We'll start by implementing a dialog element from scratch, which is way simpler than it may sound. We'll then create a popover menu, and finally, or rather, we'll then go on to adding some smooth transitions to make these new elements look and feel good, something you might actually want to use on your web page. And finally, I'll show you a real-world example of how I'm using at least the dialog element in my current project where I work today, to show you that it's not just bleeding-edge future tech, it's something you can actually start using right now. So, without further ado, I'll end the slides. Let's get up our editor, VS Code. Today, we'll be adding some features to this very basic page that I've created. As you can see, we're gonna have a demo for the Popover API and the dialog. And I think the easiest way to explain what's gonna happen is to just start. So, you might expect us to start with what is called the Popover API. I'm gonna save that until after we've implemented the dialog, just because they're touching upon a lot of similar subjects, similar nuances, but the dialog is like a tad simpler to understand, I think. So, we have a button now. We should have a button now. There we go. I hope I don't have to reload every time. That's not how it's supposed to work. When we press this button, we want to show a dialog. What's a dialog? It's an element that appears modally, meaning all the user focus gets trapped in the modal element, and you cannot interact with anything in the background. That's the essence of it. And it also should be appearing on top of everything else on the page. How's the font size? Should I zoom in more, or are you in the back? I'll do one more. Yeah, we'll see how it works, and then maybe I'll zoom out again. Actually, you know what? I'll zoom out again, and then if you guys are struggling, don't worry, you can move forward. It won't disturb me. Yeah, perfect. So, the dialog element is as simple as this. You just add a new tag with dialog in it. And right now, I think we can just add some placeholder content here. Let's say dialog title for our little heading inside. We can put some text. Congrats, you opened the dialog. Nothing is visible yet, as you can see. And then we also, let's have a small footer with maybe a close button, so you can close the dialog from within itself. So the dialog, by default, is hidden. It's something you have to manually trigger to open. And you can do that in several different ways. One of them is just by adding the open attribute. Boom. Look at this little box appearing in the middle of the screen. That's our dialog. That's the thing we just created. It's not very pretty. And this is also not what is the recommended way to show a dialog. By adding the open attribute, it'll remain open as long as open is true. But you don't get all of the modal functionality, as in you can still interact with elements in the background. You can still click on buttons and everything. That's not what we're looking for. So we're going to remove the open attribute, and instead we're going to target the dialog, the showing of the dialog, using JavaScript. But we don't need any fancy frameworks or any packages. We're just going to use some vanilla JavaScript. Yeah, heads up. Right now I'm working in a completely vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript project. No dependencies required. So that's good to know. That makes it a bit easier to maybe get inspired to use it yourself. So the old-fashioned way, when you're not using cool frameworks like React or Vue, is that you have to target, or rather, do a query selector to get all of your HTML elements available to manipulate using JavaScript. So before I do anything in the script, I'll just add an ID to our show button so it's easier to target it. We'll just call it show btn. Then we'll reference it in the script by calling this the show button. And then we have to query select for the show button. I feel like the last time I did this was, when you do the introduction courses on how to code in HTML. Now we have show button here, and we can create, or rather add a event listener to the show button. Show button, add event listener. Click. And what's going to happen when we click the button is that we want to show the dialog. So I'll just add this pseudocode for now, because in order to activate the show method of the dialog, we also have to target it with the same kind of query selector. So let's do dialog, then document query selector. We could do it with an ID, but as of now, we only have one dialog in our web page, so we can target the element directly, and it will return the single dialog element that we have. So now, this should hopefully let us add a show modal function to it. There we go. So IntelliSense also suggested another one. When you start typing show, you have both show and show modal, and then some others. Let's not go into that right now. The show one does the same as adding the show attribute. It opens it in a non-modal way. Since we already demonstrated that, we'll just try the show modal instead, since that's what you usually will want to do when implementing a dialog. OK, we have an event listener on our show button. Let's try it. All right, there's a dialog now in the middle of the screen, and you cannot interact with anything in the background anymore. There's also a slight overlay, dark gray color around everything, but it's very hard to see maybe. So we're going to do something with that as well. I think the next step is to add some basic styling, because right now this is, it's not very interesting to look at. So I'll open my CSS file where I have some predefined styles for what I want the dialog to look like. This is just plain old boring CSS, so I won't go into what I wrote there. I'll just add the class to our dialog so it gets styled. Now it should look more like this. Nice. I'll add a button class to our button so it gets a bit prettier too. Well, that's subjective, of course, but it's more obvious that it's a button now. And we can add a dialog footer class, which I've also defined in advance just to make the button appear at the very end. All right, so styling a dialog, super simple. It's just a HTML element. It has some styles applied to it by default by your browser. This can usually be reset with a global CSS reset if you use that, or just overwritten locally in the instance that you create the dialog. But most of these styles that are set by default is something you want to keep, because many of these styles are related to showing and hiding the popover, the dialog. I think the best way to demonstrate what I just talked about is to inspect the element in our browser. And we can actually see what is being applied. So right here, I'll zoom in a little bit, sorry. This is our dialog element, as you can see in the tree. And First of all, there's a new thing appearing at the very bottom of our HTML DOM tree called the top layer, which renders our dialog, or rather the dialog belongs to the top layer. This is a cool new feature that's maybe the most useful thing about the whole Dialog and Popover API that we'll look at later, is how it will always render on top of everything else, regardless of z-index or positioning values or any hacks that you've applied to your page. What's in the top layer will always be on top. Then we can see that when the dialog is open, it has this little open attribute, the one that we set manually earlier. Now it gets it automatically. And we can also see that when it's open, there's like a default user agent style sheet that applies display block to it. While when it's closed, and I'll just close it for us now, I'll explain how that works later, the same selector, or rather the opposite selector for when it's not open, now has it as display none. That's what makes it invisible to the screen. It's still in the DOM tree, but it's just not rendered visibly. Right, so that was what I wanted to show you in the dev tools for now. Let's go back to coding some more. So how do you close a dialog? Showing it was easy. How do you close it? There's 3 different ways a dialog can be closed. There's what you call a light dismiss action. Light dismiss means clicking anywhere outside of it, and that would trigger the closing. You have system-specific closing mechanisms. That means if you're on a laptop, pressing the escape key, that's considered a system-specific closing mechanism. If you're on an Android mobile phone, you often have like a back key. Pressing that would also close a dialog. And finally, you have developer-implemented ways of doing it. As in, using JavaScript, you can say that the close button inside will trigger the close function of the dialog. By default, a dialog element, when not provided with any of these options, will react on developer ways of closing it, and also the system-specific ones, escape. But clicking outside does not close it by default. To specify that we also want to include clicking outside as a closing mechanism, we use the closed by attribute, and we specify any. Any means any of the 3 methods I just mentioned. So now, when we open it, we can close it again by clicking outside. Great. Right, so that's implementing the dialog. I think we actually covered every part of the functionality at least. The styling is not quite there yet. We would like to add some transitions. Maybe we can do something with the backdrop as well, change how this looks. Because what you can see, again, in the developer tools is that the backdrop is actually an element you can select and style as you wish. Let me just expand this a little bit. So now you have the dialog again, like earlier. Here is the backdrop pseudo element. And we can add any styles we want. By default, it has a background color of black, so 0, 0, 0, and 0.1 as an alpha value, meaning it's almost completely transparent. So I think let's make it a bit prettier. We don't need to add any transitions or anything yet, but let's just style the actual backdrop element. To do that, we target the same dialog class, but this time with the pseudo selector for backdrop. And here we can add, let's see, I have a certain background color in my mind, or rather that I tried in advance that looked pretty nice. And you know what? I have some notes on my phone. I'll just make sure that we're using the exact one I found earlier. I liked it pretty well. So 2, 6, 23, and then we'll do a 0.7 on the opacity of the background color. So it's a bit darker. And I think a backdrop blur effect, which is underutilized in my opinion, makes it a bit more, backdrop filter set to blur, 4 pixels. Yeah, that looks more modern, slicker. Oof, yeah, on the projector, maybe not so much, but take my word for it. Right, so this is a functioning, no, I tricked you and myself. I pressed the close button to close it. Nothing happened, obviously, because we have not implemented the closing using the close button. So that was the final method for closing a dialog. And to activate that, we simply have to add a document selector for our close button and attach an event listener to that as well. I'll just copy-paste from the show button, close button, dot add event listener, click. And what we're going to do is call the dialog's close method. In the same way we do the show modal, it also has a close method. And here there's no need to specify modal, because when you close it, you close it. It doesn't matter if it's modal or not modal. And this should hopefully... Oh yeah, my bad. I said we had to select the close button. We did not add the ID to the close button. But now, this should hopefully let us close it with the close button. So with the escape key, with the light dismiss, and with the close button. Great. So let's move on to the Popover API. I'll show you how that works. It's quite similar. What I want us to add to this page now is a sort of user menu that will appear whenever you click on your profile picture. Very typical of web pages. Right now, nothing is happening. There's no user menu there. But I have one ready for us that looks like this. This is just a div with some elements inside. Nothing fancy, just plain old HTML and some default styling I've applied. Up here you have the header for the page, which includes this navigation element, nav, with our nav links and also the button, the user button. So we want the user button to trigger this menu, to make it appear and disappear. So the first thing we have to do is to declare the user menu as a popover element. A popover is exactly what it sounds like. It's an element that pops over, appears on top of everything else, like in the top layer. The only difference from that and the dialog is that it is non-modal. So you can still interact with other elements on the page, even though it's visible. To do that, we just add the popover attribute directly to the div that you want to make a popover. And it will be visible. It will be centered and positioned fixed by default. So it's kind of annoying, middle of the page, but we're going to make it controlled in just a moment. In order to attach the button and make it control the popover, we can add a ID, so it's easier to target the popover with the button. We'll call this user menu, because it is a user menu. Whoop. And the button, here we have a very cool kind of native HTML way of associating a button with a popover. We don't need to use any JavaScript here. You can just use a popover target attribute. And if we then provide our user menu ID here, this, okay. I will have to look at my notes. I'm sorry about this. So the popover target, yeah. You can roast me in the comments later. I'll actually have to look at my source code to make sure I'm doing this right, because I want you to actually see how it works. So this is our cheat sheet. So we do target it with popover target. We have the popover attribute on our div and the ID of user menu. So maybe all I need to do is refresh the page, perhaps. Oh, no, I see. This is a classic misunderstanding. So what's happening is the closing and opening is actually being triggered in the background. We just don't see it because we are overwriting the styles of the popover. It's also becoming display none, so invisible, to display block, visible. We have put display flex on this popover. I'll show you in the CSS in a moment now. And by Yeah, here we go. So the user menu class, this user menu, it has display flex on it at all times, meaning it overwrites the display none that was added by the browser. If I now just comment out our display flex, this will indeed trigger it. Now it doesn't look as it used to before, but it is being shown and hidden. Okay, so how do we make sure that it looks like we want to? Display flex with the flex direction column, so it kind of stacks on top of each other, while still having the option to hide and show it. We can use the the open state specifically of our popover element, using the open pseudo selector, if you can call it that. So now we can move the display flex into this selector. And what this means is that when it's open, it'll apply display flex. When it's closed, it'll still do its own native thing. Yeah. No. No, it didn't. Oh, man. Not my day today. I swear this worked before I turned my computer on and off. Sorry?
Should the open be in square brackets?
Yes. No. I mean, yes and no. Because like the dialog, it has the open attribute. The popover doesn't have the same open attribute. It has a popover open attribute. So I think the best takeaway from what's happening right now is have a good look at the documentation when you try to implement this yourself. It's very well written and detailed on MDN. I'll link to it later. And they go over all the differences between a popover, a dialog, what to watch out for, and what to use when you want to achieve specific kind of results. So now we're targeting the popover open class and adding display flex. Now it is looking nice again. Yay. Whew. OK. But it's still in the middle of the page, and it's scrolled along with us. That's not quite what we want. We'll have to overwrite some of the default styling applied here. As I said earlier, it has position fixed by default. That's not something you usually want. I'll show you, actually. Up. And thank you for the feedback. That could have saved me. So here we go. Here are all the default attributes added to the popover element by your browser. It says position fixed and also an inset of 0. Inset is just a shorthand for top, bottom, left, right. And margin auto, so it centers it by default. We want to get rid of all of those default styles, so we'll just do that. So by default, we'll set the inset to auto. We'll set the margin to 0. Position is absolute, because then it'll follow the button instead of following the page. Yes, I think that's pretty much what we want to do. OK, cool. Well, it now doesn't scroll with the page anymore, and it is in the top part of the page, but it's not attached to the button visually, even though they're linked functionality-wise. So now we're going to use some more, I was going to say, bleeding edge CSS that hasn't been supported in all browsers until very recently, in January 2026. Firefox, who was the last browser to not support what I'm going to show you now, finally added support for it. So this is very relevant for everyone developing for any kind of browser. We're going to use what we call a position anchor. We're going to say that the button is the user menu's anchor, and they'll be linked visually as well. So to do that, we just need to specify the position anchor attribute for the user menu. And now to target the user menu, the user button, we have to give the user button an anchor name. So I'll just target the user button with this class. It already has it applied there somewhere else. And here you have to say that it has an anchor name of, let's say, user button. That's a good anchor name. So as Dylan mentioned earlier, CSS variables are written usually in this format, or not usually, always, with a dash dash to signify that this is a custom attribute name or variable name. And now we should be able to target the user button in this position anchor. So we'll just say user button here. Okay, but that's not all we have to do. We also have to specify how should it be positioned in relation to the anchor that we've just assigned to it. And for that, we use, we use a top left and a top left, right, bottom attributes that you usually use to position absolutely positioned element. But instead of saying a specific number, you can say anchor. And then the name, which side of the anchor you want to attach the side of the popover to. So by saying top and then anchor bottom, for example, now the top of our popover is going to be attached to the bottom of our anchor. And same for example, the right side. Let's attach it to the right side of our anchor. And now we've achieved this visual link between them. That's usually what you want. It's a bit close, so we can add some spacing around, maybe some margin top. That would make sense in this case. For example, 8 pixels. Oops, sorry. Yeah, we did it. We implemented a popover and a dialog, both using the top layer, both appearing on top of everything else on your page, and having accessibility and keyboard navigation baked into them without having to do anything more than that. The browsers take care of everything. And screen readers are also very happy with these native implementations. You don't have to trick them into saying, no, you cannot focus on that element because there's something else in front of it. That's been a huge challenge up to now. OK, great. We have the elements. We stumbled through them, but we did it. What I want to... Yeah.
Does the menu have the like dismiss?
Yes. Good question. By default, it does. So now I'll click outside. It closes. It also has the escape. And you can also target it using JavaScript in the same manner we did with the dialog. So it's very flexible. You can, of course, have side effects happen when you close it using JavaScript, make something else also happen. Very flexible, yeah, and stylable, none the least. I want to show you, I think we have time to add some transitions, at least to the dialog to start with, and then maybe we'll do the popover as well.
Sorry, one question
yeah.
Before you move on to transitions. Can you use this to do then tooltips? Because there is JavaScript libraries to do tooltips and stuff.
Yeah.
Can this replace all that?
I'm glad you're asking, yeah. OK, it's because we've been talking about popovers. And right now, we've used a popover to create a user menu. But semantically, they're not tied to any kind of particular element. Anything can be displayed as a popover and still have semantics of whatever element you want. For example, a tooltip. This can be used for a tooltip. You can have a hover, trigger it, using JavaScript then. As long as you add the correct semantics to your markup, to the HTML, which I have not done in this case, by the way. I'm just using plain old divs, not very friendly for the screen readers. But that wasn't the point of the presentation. That's why I skipped it. So yes, you can use it to make tooltips, yeah. There's also an attribute which is called hint, or something similar. I have not used it myself. What it does is, right now, if you have a popover open, and you open another popover, the previous one will close by default, unless it has a hint attribute, in which case it will allow others to stay open. So say you have something open, you want to hover over something, get a tooltip, it'll still stay open if you use the hint attribute. Yeah, so popovers can be semantically anything you want. That's really great. It can be a select, it can be a drop-down menu, a tooltip, or any other kind of use case you can imagine. All right, let's make the dialog smooth now. I think that's the most important part of the presentation. We will I think a good way of making it transition smoothly is to, let's say, go from opacity 0, so invisible, to whoop, fade in. And also maybe, let's make it become a little bit bigger. It's like scale it up a little bit so it reaches its full size and has this little whoop effect with sound effects. Great, you know what I mean. So what we'll do is we're going to have to target the open state of the dialog and say which values do we want it to have when it's open. That's going to be the default visible values. And a bit annoyingly, here we actually do use the open attribute selector using square brackets instead of like a colon and then popover open, like we did for popover. So I think that's the world of CSS. They add stuff gradually, and sometimes, again, like Dylan said, they wish they had a time machine to make everything a bit more similar, but it's too late. It's the web. If you change it, it's going to break many websites. So we're selecting the open dialog like this. Here we'll say it has an opacity of 1, which means fully visible, and scale 1, which is normal size. Then we can say in the default, or rather closed state, that it should go from opacity 0 and scale 0.95, so it's just a little bit under the full size. Now I'll add the transition properties so that we tell the browser we want to animate these two specific properties. We'll say opacity for 0.2 seconds and ease, so it kind of smooths in. And then scale as well, 0.2 seconds, ease. Okay, let's see how this works. I know in advance it's not going to work, but I'm going to take you through why it doesn't work. Okay, I'll tell you why. Because the dialog is changing from display none when it's closed to display flex or block or whatever you set. When something is transitioning from invisible to visible, any other transition properties are not going to play out. They will only play out if they go from a visible state to another visible state, which is not the case here. A way to get around that is to use also a semi-modern CSS feature, starting style @rule. And this is specifically for these use cases. You write starting style when you want something to fade in or to have an initial style applied to it the first time it appears on the screen. So when it goes from display none to display visible. Here again, we target our open dialog. And we say we can just copy these default values for opacity and scale. And now it fades in. Very nice. So it goes from these initial starting styles to the open styles. And when we close it, we expect it to return to these default styles. But it doesn't happen because it goes to display none as it disappears from the screen before the animations have time to happen. To give them time to happen, we have to also transition or add a transition for the display property itself. Display being the invisible, visible part of it. And the gotcha here is that display isn't normally transitionable or animatable. In order to opt in and say that, yes, we do want to animate the display property, we have to use a new CSS feature called allow discrete, which stands for allow discrete animations. Also, the dialog element itself has a nice little gotcha. The thing that puts it in the top layer and makes it visible on top of everything else is its own CSS property called overlay, which also has to be transitioned in order to make it look as seamless as you wish it to be. All of this is explained in detail in the documentation, so I recommend you to look at that if you're curious about why we have to add all these extra values. But now, this should hopefully smooth in and smooth out. Great, we did it. One thing we can do to improve this is also add a transition to the backdrop. Because while the dialog box itself kind of fades in and out as we want, The backdrop kind of just blinks in and out. Not very exciting. So we'll do basically the same for the backdrop. We will add some, I was going to say, default styles for when it's invisible. We'll animate the background color and the backdrop filter. So it'll blur in gradually and also become darker gradually. So let's target the open dialog's backdrop element. In here, we can put our default values, so the ones that we just specified earlier. And then in here, we set the same values, but just to initial 0 values. So 0 being completely transparent, and the blur also, 0 pixels, no blur. Oh, I'm sorry about that. That. But we have the same issues that we did with the dialog. We have to add a starting style to make sure, because the backdrop also goes from display none to display visible. And we also have to add the allow discrete for display. So I'll just do that really quickly here. But essentially, when you've added all of these styles and rules, it should be able to just, you can reuse them, like make a reusable component out of it. You don't have to type this every single time you want to make a dialog element, for example. And that's kind of the beauty of it. It's still all relatively simple compared to downloading an external dependency and learning to do it their way. So now we added the default closed invisible styles to the starting style. Oh, and we also have to, of course, add the actual transition. Thank you. So what do we have? Backdrop filter and background color. Yeah, I hope this isn't too boring to watch, but the final result will be nice, I promise. Backdrop filter, 0.2 seconds ease, and now we'll also add a display, 0.2 seconds ease with allow discrete. And from what I remember, I don't think the overlay transition property is required for the backdrop, as it doesn't appear in the overlay itself. Now, yeah, we got it. We transition in and out on both the dialog element and the backdrop, making it look very pretty with, well, some CSS, but a safe amount of it. Something I can live with at least. Also, what is cool is that right now we're going from initial values in starting style to open values, and then back out to closed values. These are right now the same, right? The closed value and the starting style values are identical. You can, if you want, have different values in there to make it animate, say, from one direction. You can fade in from the top, and when you close it, it can fade out to the bottom by having different values in the default styles and in the starting styles. Okay. Also, yeah, if you have any questions while I talk, you can just interrupt me. That's fine. So very similar principles apply to the popover. I won't go through them again because it's very boilerplatey at this point. But using the same allow discrete for the display property, you also can make it fade in and fade out and make sure it finishes its animations before it's disappearing completely from the DOM. All right, so we got the animations done. What I want to show you now is, I was going to show you how I'm using this in at my work, but I think an important question is also browser compatibility. How safe is it to use this today, and how does it look for the future? How soon can you start using it? So I've just gotten a lot of MDN links up here. Instead of making slides, I've just decided to show it to you right here. Yeah, we'll zoom in one more. The dialog element itself is widely available. That's not what I was going to click, my bad. See full compatibility. Right now, every major browser supports the dialog element. There is only one little annoyance, is that Safari doesn't yet support the closed by attribute. And that's actually a pretty big thing, because in order to, well, use the light dismiss, click outside the dialog to close it, you need the close by attribute. And that makes it a bit of a showstopper if you want to start using it in your project, because that's a key feature, I think, of a dialog element. So the way around it is, I'll show you the way around it later when I show you how we use this in our project. But it is, again, we're back to using a certain amount of small hacks, which is annoying. But this will come at some point, I know. It should. The popover attribute, it's also baseline available. And here it should work as expected for every browser. The hint value I talked about earlier is still experimental, the one that says that it can stay open. A popover can stay open if you hover over another one or interact with another popover that has the hint attribute. So you can have several popovers open at the same time. But position anchor, this one makes me really happy, because I started working on this presentation last year, before Christmas, before the new year, at which point it wasn't baseline available. Firefox was not yet ready to use, or had not yet implemented position anchor, making an anchor button or whatever element visually linked with the popover. So you had to use a polyfill or other ways to get around that problem. But now they finally got it since January, since I think 2 weeks ago or something, which is great. Not every single nuance of features are available, but the main one, position anchor, the one that we looked at, is now ready in every single browser.
Is that specific to the popovers, or could you use that for...
You can use that as well. Yeah, good question. Other elements as well. I can now use the position anchor, which is a very powerful way of positioning elements on the page now. Before, you had to be very careful of wrapping things correctly, position absolute, trick around with that. With position anchor, you can pretty much say, it doesn't matter where you are on the page, just put me next to that element. Yeah, I'm excited to start using this more now that it's actually baseline available. It's great news. And finally, the transition behavior, the thing that made transitioning in and out of the dialog element and the popover possible. It says baseline available, so the actual transition behavior flag is possible, as well as the allow discrete on every browser. But the gotcha is that transitions, specifically for the display property, when set to allow discrete, are not yet possible on Firefox, not Safari. I feel they're competing for missing features, so I keep forgetting which one has it and doesn't. So what does this mean for you if you want to start using these elements and also have transitions? If you don't do anything about it, it's basically going to be it's going to work as an opt-in or like an incremental upgrade for your users. If they have it available in their browsers, they'll see the animations. If not, they won't see the animations, but the functionality will still be there. They can still use your site, and things will still appear in the places they should appear. So I think it's up to you to make a decision if it's worth it or not to use at this point, specifically for this animation property. Yeah, so those are the browser compatibility checklists. Good to know about, and hopefully they'll just get better and better as we move on. So, final part of my little talk is showing you what I'm using today in my project. We have made a reusable dialog element, or component rather, that uses the native element, the dialog element, at its core. But we have made some adjustments, some minor hacks to make sure it works as expected on every browser. We also implemented this quite earlier, before more of these features were baseline available. But it looks like this. It's a customizable modal element, like you would expect. I think the coolest thing we have, and it's a good showcase of like what a modal or rather a dialog can be. It doesn't have to be a box in the middle of the screen. A dialog is just something that appears on everything else modally. So it can be a left drawer, for example, come in from the right side if you want, from anywhere. The transitions that you use, completely up to you. The position of it, also up to you. But it's still a modal, and you cannot interact with the background. And now, in order to make these transitions work before allow discrete was baseline available, we have used good old timeouts in a way. So you close it, a timer starts to make the transition happen. When the timer is done, we actually do the closing request for the dialog element itself. So I'm looking forward to replace that kind of good old hackiness with native methods when they are completely ready. Also, top layer, fun facts. An element in the top layer, like this dialog, will appear over everything else until another element is added to the top layer. So the order of when you show elements determines what appears on top of each other in the top layer specifically. So if I open a new dialog now, it will appear on top of this. And you might think that it's because it's a sub-dialog, that it's open from inside the other dialog. But the same would happen if I somehow managed to open a dialog from a completely separate place. It would visually appear on top until something else appeared on top. And now this traps the focus. So I cannot interact with the element behind it until this one is closed. And now until this one is closed. So it makes it very predictable. It doesn't require you to hack with Z indexes. And please don't use any Z indexes for this kind of purposes. I think it might mess up how it's intended to be used. And the same way, that makes you also able to show, for example, a toast, even when you have a dialog open, which covers the whole screen. But if you want to show a little chip, it'll come on top of that as long as you've decided to show it after the dialog has been opened. But that is not how we do it, because we have not implemented the toasts using the Popover API, or the top layer. We are currently teleporting the toasts on top of the dialog to make this work as we want it to work. So that's the hack we had to do before everything was baseline available. This is also something I'm looking forward to simplifying in the future and making it easier to maintain as well. Right. I think we've covered pretty much everything. We have around 10 minutes left, but I feel like I may have covered most of it already. So I'll just say thank you. And if you have any more questions, feel free to ask me about them. I also have one more slide, just a moment. Hold your applause, thank you. Yeah. I swear I'll be better prepared for next NDC. Real world example. Now, final slide. Thank you very much.